Okay, good morning, everyone. This is Tamara Sale with the ESA Center for Excellence at OHSU PSU School of Public Health in Oregon. And Jason, well, I want to welcome Jason Schiffman today as our presenter. I'm really excited to have him. Jason, could you move it to the next slide? We're working off of his screen today, so. This webinar is being sponsored by ESA and PEPNet. If you all haven't joined PEPNet, I'll put the link in the chat box to join. It's a great source of information for anyone who hasn't. It's sponsored by the National Training and Technical Assistance Center for Children's Behavioral Health, which is funded by SAMHSA and coordinated through the University of Maryland. Next slide. Okay, so welcome, Jason. I am truly in awe of Jason's work. He is a professor of psychology and director of clinical training at the University of Maryland in Baltimore County. And he's a graduate of University of Southern California. He's co-director of the Maryland Early Intervention Program's Strive for Wellness Clinic, which provides a combination of research, training, and services, and he'll tell you more about that. He's had a bunch of different grants from NIMH, SAMHSA, et cetera. Has published more than 120 scientific articles, all related to the identification and treatment of early psychosis. And his research focuses both on identification as well as understanding the effects of psychosocial interventions and how to reduce stigma generally. So he's going to be sharing some of that research with us, and talking about how he's been conceptualizing care. So welcome, Jason. I'm excited to be learning from you today.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I couldn't be more honored and privileged, really, to host this webinar today. So I'm delighted and grateful for the invitation, and I'm a big fan of both ESA and PEPNet. So this is a real honor. I want to first start by saying that all of this work is the product of a very large team. That I'm just one small member who gets to talk to you all today. But I'm grateful for all the folks that are listed on this slide and many others who weren't, and their contributions have really made anything that's of benefit that I'll share with you possible. So I have some learning objectives, and they're briefly to become familiar with how our clinic is conceptualized and organized, CHR-P program development, and our service delivery through our research, and that's the point that I'm going to emphasize today. I contemplated different approaches to my remarks today, and I thought what would be more instructive, as opposed to just saying sort of like how we do things, would be to rather reflect on some of the research that led us to the clinic that we have. So hopefully some of that will be useful, and if you have questions about that or want more information, I'm always happy to share. Towards the end, I'll talk about our modular approach to care and potential resources that we can provide with respect to early identification of risk for psychosis, as well as a treatment. So to begin, our Strive for Wellness Clinic began as a state-funded initiative back in 2013, and it primarily focused on assessment. Here you'll see an image of myself and Bob Buchanan, who's the head of what we refer to as the Maryland Early Intervention Program, and Gloria Reeves, my colleague, who's a psychiatrist down at the School of Medicine as well. And our mission was really to help find folks in the state of Maryland who might be on a trajectory towards developing an illness related to psychosis. This was a joint venture that had strong support from the governor, and that really it began our work towards what we now have as a clinic. But again, in the early years, it was just it became assessment, and it was through that assessment that we're able to develop a lot of the research that I want to share with you today. So as a sort of an overview as to what our clinic is all about, we have different components to our work: outreach and recruitment. We have a lot of training. A lot of the efforts that drive our clinic are from the hard work of our trainees I have many graduate students, professional staff, a clinical intern, and we're all very dedicated to training folks through our clinic. And I believe that contributes to our sustainability as well, because we have young, energetic staff who really push things forward. But all of this is sort of, under the larger umbrella of research and how research guides what we do clinically. This work is driven by notions of a progression towards psychosis, a sort of a neurodevelopmental hypothesis of psychosis and illnesses related to psychosis, such as schizophrenia. And as probably most folks that are joining this call are interested, we're interested in this attenuated psychosis symptoms stage, which signifies the ascension of problematic symptoms that are related to psychosis, usually in a lesser than form than fully diagnosable psychosis, but represent impairment and distraction and distress. A lot of this work, and probably the work that most of us are doing, is motivated in large part by this notion of duration of untreated psychosis. So if you were to imagine that the arrow, the pink arrow in the background, is the passage of time, and the box that says psychosis and the arrow above it, the onset of psychosis, that's like sort of like, let's say, a magic moment when the threshold of psychosis is passed. Then more time passes on average until treatment is initiated. And the distance between these two time points is referred to as the duration of untreated psychosis. And painfully, it's this duration of untreated psychosis, on average in the United States, lasts about 2 years. And so, I think this is a particularly appalling statistic. But the work of early intervention clinics and clinical high-risk clinics is all about working with folks prior to developing psychosis. So if you look further back in time, you see the onset of the risk state. And that's when psychosis attenuated symptoms begin. And if we can work with people during this time, we might be able to, in some cases, forestall the future onset of psychosis, minimize its impact if it does indeed occur, and maybe in some cases prevent psychosis. But at the very least, our efforts are driving us towards lowering the duration of untreated psychosis, and in some cases providing a warm handoff if a person is going to develop psychosis to a first episode specialty clinic. So longer DUP is associated with just about anything negative that you can imagine. Worse long-term outcomes, more intensive needs for services, more negative symptoms, more social impairment, more occupational impairment, more neuropsych deficits, psychological distress, and likely increased burden to the system. On the flip side, however, shorter DUP is good. So all those negative things, they flip on their head if we can reduce duration of untreated psychosis. So limiting that time is really a crucial endeavor. That endeavor is not specific just to mental health clinicians, however. So in fact, I think it takes a village or an entire community. So regardless of your role in the community or your efforts to make things better, there's all sorts of different ways and different people that play a part in the early identification of youth who might be on a trajectory towards psychosis. When thinking about how we recognize folks who might be on a trajectory towards risk or who are showing high-risk signs of psychosis, we have to look for potential symptoms or signs. So here's some very early warning signs: feeling like something's not quite right, jumbled thoughts and confusion, trouble speaking clearly, unnecessary fear, declining interest in people, activities, and self-care, potentially comments from other people, other observations, or deterioration in functioning, such as in school, work, or in hygiene. Now, hopefully most of you are thinking at this point, like, wow, those are some pretty generic, non-specific warning signs. And that is in fact the case. So most people who have these concerns are not going to develop psychosis, but it could be a flag or an indication that further probing or additional questions might be useful for understanding that person's potential trajectory and mental health in general. To go a step further, the structured interview for psychosis risk syndromes, or the SIFs, is a semi-structured interview that's used to dig deeper and to understand how a person's experiences might relate to psychosis risk. It screens for attenuated positive symptoms that are characteristic or that define the clinical high-risk state. And the instrument itself is able to distinguish between folks who might be at low risk for psychosis, high risk for psychosis, and who have crossed a threshold for psychosis. It's divided into characteristic signs of psychosis known within the SIPs as the P symptoms, or the positive symptoms, symptoms P1 through P5, unusual thought content, suspiciousness or persecutory ideas, grandiose ideas, perceptual abnormalities, hallucinations, and disorganized communication. Clinicians use the SIPs to rate how folks are doing. There's, in addition to the positive symptoms, there's negative symptoms, disorganized symptoms, and general symptoms. And the anchors and the rating tools within the SIPs allow for the interviewer to make a determination as to low risk, high risk, or having crossed the threshold for psychosis. Now, I just spend some time talking about the SIPs as a potential foundational moment for the rest of the talk, because the majority of our work revolves around the SIPs. I will say, though, that the SIPs is not an instrument that lives in sort of only an academic ivory tower. The SIPs corresponds very closely to a diagnosis now located within the DSM-5, within the other specified schizophrenia spectrum and other psychotic disorders. And it's billable at 298.8 if your system bills. But this is actually sort of with what we used to refer to as psychosis, not otherwise specified. But it is in the last page of the schizophrenia section within the DSM-5. Excuse me. Despite the fact that the SIPS construct of clinical high risk or attenuated psychosis syndrome is represented within the DSM, it's possible that folks in the general community or certainly practicing clinicians aren't yet quite aware of what the clinical high risk for psychosis state is all about. And so in some early work, we wanted to understand how community providers perceive folks that might be at risk for psychosis and what they would, what labels they would ascribe to them. So in the first study that I want to talk about very briefly, we had a national sample of psychiatrists, clinical psychologists, and general practitioners, and we sent them vignettes. These were vignettes that were validated with respect to their accuracy in portraying the clinical high-risk phase of psychosis. And what we found was that when we asked these practitioners to diagnose, or what label they would give someone that meets criteria for risk, without telling them any labels, they said that these folks had crossed the threshold for psychosis. So the attenuated psychosis risk syndrome was commonly mistaken for full threshold psychotic disorders. Furthermore, the providers, when asked what treatment they would recommend, they recommended antipsychotic medication, which is not indicated for people in the risk phase of illness. Certainly, antipsychotics are first-line treatment for people that have crossed the threshold for psychosis if the person feels like that's in their best interest. But not for, it's much more controversial for risk. So misdiagnosing, overdiagnosing, and potentially overtreating or overprescribing. In digging a little deeper into what we can understand about providers and who might be best equipped to help people that are in the clinical high-risk phase, Emily Klein, who was a student with me and now is a professor at Harvard, she and Sean Davis and I worked on a study probing local community providers as to their comfort and familiarity with people that might be at risk for psychosis or in the early phases of psychosis. And here we had the suspicion that folks who specialize in working with young people were comfortable working in schools and working with families, but maybe didn't get as much training or weren't as comfortable working with people with fully diagnosed psychosis such as schizophrenia. On the flip side, we speculated that people who were comfortable working with people with schizophrenia didn't have a lot of comfort working in schools or with families or with youth. And this comes to bear because this age window of risk for psychosis tends to be somewhere between, say, 15 and 22 or so. So in sometimes what's referred to as a transition-aged youth period of development or time. And so the traditional models of training are helping people work mostly with young people or mostly with older people, but not an intersection with respect to psychosis or psychosis risk. And in fact, this is what the data suggested. So in general, people that were trained as child practitioners were comfortable with kids but not psychosis. In general, people that were trained as adult practitioners were comfortable with people with schizophrenia and psychosis, but not necessarily with families or schools or youth. However, there was a group of people who identified as sort of getting both types of training, and they in fact felt comfortable working in that intersection, which really speaks to the need for more folks trained specifically to work in the TAE age range as we think about training pipelines in the future. All of this leads to additional considerations around mental health provider systems. So the systems in which we operate are incredibly important. And as probably is the case for most of your systems, public mental health systems tend to be bifurcated, often split around the time of risk. So you have child-serving agencies and adult-serving agencies, or child-serving systems and adult-serving systems. And I don't know that we could sort of paint a less adaptive picture for people that might be at risk for psychosis by having the bifurcation around this time. You just imagine schools, maybe you're 17, you're in schools. Even if you're not totally connected within the school, you have people, adults, looking out for you, or with their eyes open. You turn 18, you graduate, and you're on your own with a whole new system that's around you that's not necessarily inclusive or easy to access. That being said, the ray of hope comes in a few studies that we've pursued. The one that I want to share with you here is just a very brief study that we did where we were able to demonstrate that with some training not too different from a webinar like this, practitioners who have little experience with psychosis or psychosis risk can not only learn about psychosis risk, but their intentions to refer and to work with folks increase as well. So this is just a simple pre- and post-workshop design where we looked at change over the time of the workshop, and folks felt after the workshop much more comfortable in working with people at risk for psychosis with pretty reasonable effect sizes. That study and just sort of our own belief that training can be useful springboarded us towards a larger study where our efforts were to reduce duration of untreated psychosis by getting the word out to an important stakeholder group. That's in our case, we were looking for social workers in the state of Maryland, not necessarily social workers that focus on mental health, but just social workers in general, as social workers, at least in our state, and I'm sure across the nation, work with vulnerable folks who might be at risk for psychosis. So what we did here was we created an online continuing education workshop that really focused on early identification and screening of psychosis. We did this within the context of a randomized controlled trial, with one of the arms being just about screening and the other arm about screening specifically to psychosis risk. And we offered continuing ed to over 1,400 social workers in the state of Maryland. And this is just sort of like an overview of our work here, led by one of my advanced graduate students, Nikki Andorko. You'll see here on the one side of this screen of the play button, that's myself and my colleague Melissa Smith, and we're the trainers throughout here, and we have graphic animations about psychosis risk and about what to do and working with clients. And this work was also in collaboration with Bob Buchanan, Jordan DeBouter from Fordham, and John Fitzgerald. But what we've seen as a function of this work is that referrals to our early intervention program, our larger first episode and clinical high risk consortium, is that about 20% of our referrals now are coming from someone that's seen our training video. So we're excited about getting the word out and penetrating in places that we hadn't yet in the past. An important aspect within that training and just general penetration of of identifying folks who might be at risk for psychosis in general is through risk screening. So a lot of our efforts have been focused on using screening tools to better find folks who might be on a trajectory towards developing psychosis or in the early phases of psychosis. Now, just broadly speaking, when thinking about screening for an illness, psychosis or otherwise, there are some 7 checklist of things that sort of make or break whether or not screening is something that should be pursued. The first question is the disease that you're screening for, does it have serious consequences? And of course, that's a checkbox yes for psychosis. Is there a high prevalence of the prodromal phase? In other words, do people have signs or symptoms that precede fully diagnosable illness? In this case, we call that the clinical high-risk phase of illness, and the answer to that is yes as well. Can we find folks before a critical point? We do believe that if we find people that are earlier on a developmental trajectory towards psychosis before they cross the threshold, that intervention could be effective. So we say yes. Is screening non-invasive? The screening tools that we use tend to be, or are, in fact, all self-report. So pretty quick, between a minute to 5 minutes, and paper, pencil, or on the computer. Is screening affordable? Again, cheap for, paper, pencil kind of things. Does treatment exist? And if it is it effective, and is it too risky? Without medications, the field believes that it's not too risky and that it can be effective for lots of different reasons. And then the last point are the psychometrics sound? And that was the question that we really wanted to dive into. You know, what are the psychometrics of some of the tools that are out there for risk? Let's see. So for self-report measures, there's some strengths, that they're brief, broad application. They focus on the positive symptoms of risk, which align with the gold standard tools to assess risk. And in fact, we believe that they have solid criterion validity, which I'll talk about in a bit. Portending future comments that I'm going to make, there are some questions yet to be answered with respect to self-report measures that I'll tackle later on in the presentation, but they're unable to take culture or context into account because there's no back and forth, there's no conversation. And there could be potential moderators or different psychometric qualities that can make them better or stronger. But nonetheless, despite their limitations, they are the first line of defense for identifying folks at risk for psychosis. Just give me 1 second. I wonder if my automatic timer is on here. Yep. Okay. All right, I'm back. Okay, let's see. So to complement screening tools, there's clinical interviews. So I mentioned the SIPs, and I'm going to talk more about the SIPs in a moment. But downsides of SIPs, despite their strong clinical utility, is that they take a long time, and they require extensive training to be proficient and certified. So screening can be useful to complement more comprehensive diagnostic evaluations, and usually to precede them. So screening tools can be used to identify and monitor, can help find people that aren't in services. So when you think about that image that I showed that had all of the one circle about youth at risk and all the different people that are needing to line up to help, screening can help all of them. Screening can also make it more efficient and accurate when we're doing full evaluations of the SIPs. And then the other thing that I want to emphasize here is that assessment often is treatment. So the mere process of evaluation or monitoring can be an effective tool in and of itself. The research that supports some of the psychosis risk screening tools that we've been thinking about, this is a study, one of the first studies that we did, led by Emily again, where we looked at the convergent validity of different screening tools. And basically, in a nutshell, what we did here was we gave several different screening tools for psychosis risk, as well as other tools unrelated to psychosis risk or tangentially related to psychosis risk, to a large group of people, and we simply saw how well the measures correlated with each other. So the bottom line on this slide is that tools that are designed to assess for risk for psychosis correlate very strongly with one another. Not perfectly, but very strongly. And they correlate less so with other measures of other related but not as related constructs, for instance, anxiety or depression. And they correlate non-significantly with unrelated constructs, such as an exercise questionnaire, for instance. So here's our first evidence that, at the very least, measures sort of converge together. Now, to take it a step further, we had to see whether or not our screening tools linked or correlated or predicted our diagnostic evaluation. So you'll see a picture here of the Psychosis Risk Syndrome Handbook. This was written by my SIPS mentor and dear friend Barbara Walsh, who's pictured on the right. And within our team, Caroline Romer, Miranda Bridgewater, and Emily Petty are three of the main interviewers who conduct most of our interviews within our clinic and for our participants and clients. The SIPS itself is the most common used instrument in North America, and as I mentioned before, low risk, high risk, and psychosis outcomes based on the SIPS. Again, capturing positive symptoms that are used to identify a person that might be at risk for psychosis: unusual thought content, suspiciousness, grandiosity, perceptual abnormalities, and disorganized communication. In this study, what we wanted to see was what was the agreement between the self-report screening and the clinician-led gold standard diagnostic interview. So here what we had were folks who took the self-report screening and then were interviewed by one of our specialists. And what we found was that, by and large, the three primary screening for psychosis risk self-report tools that we used correlated very highly with the gold standard interview. So there was strong criterion validity. Now, we weren't really powered to determine if there were significant differences between the three measures, but what we found was that the three measures sort of worked equivalently and were fairly accurate and consistently so. To go a little bit further and to go beyond what we produced ourselves, Emily took lead on a very comprehensive review of psychosis screening tools in the field. And what she found was an affirmation of our early work, in that by and large, most screening tools showed high accuracy in identifying individuals at risk according to the full interview. So again, screening tools are relatively comparable, but also relatively accurate. We also found that if you assess not just for the presence or absence of an experience, but whether or not that experience was distressing or interfering, accuracy increased as well. So presence and also the nature of the experience are important. What I'm showing here now are the first four items of a tool called the Prime Screen. This was authored by Barbara Walsh and Scott Woods and others at the Yale Prime Clinic. And it's a nice compendium to the SIPS, who was also authored by that same group of folks. They gave us permission to add a distress scale to it. So, but you can see the first question. I think that I felt that there are odd or unusual things going on that I can't explain. And then there's a scale from definitely disagree all the way to definitely agree. And then the prompt after that is, when this happens, I feel frightened or concerned or it causes problems for me. Again, from definitely disagree to definitely agree. Now, there's slightly different variations in scoring of this tool, and it's a 12-item measure. I'm just showing the first four questions. But if a person circles definitely agree or 1 6, then that's an indication that it might be a good idea to refer to for a SIPS evaluation. Or 2 5s. We do 1 6 or 2 5s. But regardless, if a person even circles a 3 or a 4, we use this tool as a conversation starter. So many times folks who are even in therapy, have issues related to psychosis, but their psychosis, the stigma against psychosis is so strong that even though they have good rapport with you and they seem open about many of their experiences, they're reluctant to share, and no one's necessarily ever asked them. So I really think that the Prime Screen, in addition to helping us, sort of empirically find people that might be on a trajectory towards risk, it also is just a good way to open up conversation about risk in general. Now, there are other tools that I like to share beyond specific tools designed for psychosis risk. One of them that I'll talk about is called the BASC-2. It's now moved on to the BASC-3, but I think the items are fairly consistent. But the BASC-2, if you're not familiar with it, it's similar to the CBCL, and if you're not familiar with that, they're large checklists, so maybe 100, 120 items with really short items, and then you endorse either yes or no, or to the degree to which you believe in that the statement is true of you. There's different versions of it. There's one for parents, there's one for youth, there's also one for teachers. And there is, it comes with a variety of different scales. So some psychopathology scales like depression, anxiety, some functioning scales like how you're doing in school, some strengths like resiliency, for instance. Now, there is also within the BASC a scale called atypicality. And this scale asks questions that seemingly resemble or are related to psychosis risk. And so we've evaluated the psychometric properties of the atypicality scale. And what we found was that the atypicality scale works pretty much equivalently to those other specific psychosis risk screening questionnaires that I was mentioning earlier, like the PRIME screen. Now, it's much longer, but it gives you a lot more information and makes conversation a little bit easier and beyond just specifically talking about psychosis risk. One thing that I want to emphasize here is that in some of our work we found that the BASC parent version can predict risk for psychosis along with the BASC self-report. So, and interestingly enough, and this was pioneered by Liz Thompson, one of my graduates who's now at a postdoc at Brown. But what she found was that the two parent and self-reports didn't correlate all that strongly, but they both correlated to clinician-ascribed risk for psychosis, both adding unique variants to the prediction of risk. So parent input can be really important. In another study, using an alternative method besides a screening tool to predict to SIPS gold standard status, my recent graduate, Thomas Suji, who's a VA in the Maryland system, or he's a psychologist at the VA Maryland system now. He looked at the capacity of the schedule for affective disorders and schizophrenia, or commonly known as the KSADS, to see whether the screening items within the KSADS, which is an interview screen as opposed to a self-report screen, could align with psychosis risk tools such as the SIPS. And then lo and behold, it actually does. So here's some questions from the KSADS. Has there ever been a time when your mind played tricks on you? Sometimes children might hear voices or see things or smell things that other people cannot hear or see or smell. Has this ever happened to you? Have you had any ideas about things that you didn't tell anyone because you were afraid they might not understand? So these questions are part of the KSADS, and they, if a person endorses some of those questions, there's a good chance that they might benefit from a SIPS evaluation. So overall accuracy between the KSADS and the SIPS is about 78%. Now I know that not everyone does the KSADS in general practice, but more people use the KSADS than they do the SIPS. And so it's just something to be on the lookout for. If your agency happens to use the KSADS, it might be a good pre-screening tool that you could implement without actually doing anything different other than just looking to see how they did on that screening section. See the accuracy there, about 78%. Okay, so a very practical approach to screening is to think about brevity. Another one of my students who was actually just a research associate with me when he was on internship, Peter Phelan. What Peter did was look at screening results of almost 500 people and distill them analytically to see what items, if we could just drill it down to just two items, two very easy items, which two items are the best ones to pick if we were going to screen for psychosis risk. And through the empirical approach as well as sort of like a construct validity or face validity approach, we nailed it down to these two items. Do you ever hear the voice of someone talking that other people cannot hear? And have you ever felt that someone was playing with your mind? These two items have really strong sensitivity and even stronger specificity. So a lot of times what I'll hear from folks in the community is that, even though the prime screen is only 12 items, it's awkward to administer. It takes too much time. It's hard to pull it into our system. When I say that we might have a 2-item screening tool that could be useful, they perk up a little bit and say, well, maybe 2 items could be possible. And I'll get back to how we implemented the 2-item screening in a moment. But if you are contemplating implementation of screening, some important questions to think about include who's going to be doing the screening? Are there any budgetary concerns? Sometimes getting into schools, even just the cost of copies is a consideration. Time limitations. Are you thinking about screening more universally, or is there some indication of screening that has to happen first? How are you going to manage feedback? And do you have an adequate referral network? If you get positive referrals, how are you going to work with them? And an important question, of course, is which tool are you going to use? So that's a question I get quite a bit, and I have some thoughts about that. The answer is ultimately it depends. It depends on what your aspirations are. But we tend to, like if we're just going to use one in our clinic, we use the prime screen. Only 12 items, so it's really short, designed by the SIPs authors for the SIPs, and it seems to correspond well with SIPs diagnoses. We have edited the SIPs, the prime screen, augmented it with questions about distress, makes it slightly longer, but gives us more information. We also have a prime screen parent version that we use when appropriate and when working with parents. The PQB is another screening tool that I want to emphasize that's really well researched and an excellent tool overall. I like the PQB quite a bit. Just 21 items, and it has the stress scales as well. And I know a lot of folks are using that. Rachel Lowy is the first author on that, and she does a great job. Okay, so the Prime 8 is a tool that we're currently creating, but the Prime 8 with the stress is a tool that we think takes like the best 8 items from the Prime to distill it even further to make it that much shorter. I mentioned and described the BASC. It's comprehensive. There's a parent version. The downsides of the BASC are that it's long and it's not free. So, but it may be worth it depending on your situation. Case ads. I recommend the case ads if you're doing it anyway, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend it if you don't need it, if you're not doing it anyway. And then the 2-item screening. Again, I'm putting them here in case you want to like take a picture of them or memorize them or whatever. But I think that these items are really really important gateway to further screening. So do you ever hear the voice of someone talking that other people cannot hear? Have you ever felt that someone was playing with your mind? 2 really powerful items. Okay. Some animation there. All right. Now, we offer an online prime screen. Doha Chabani, the clinical coordinator for our CHR-P grant, is pictured down below, and she's sort of the keeper of our online prime screen information. So it's an accessible platform for clients, providers, and others. HIPAA compliant via REDCap, and it really helps facilitate easy record keeping and getting back to folks quickly. So when we go out and do community outreach, we provide a link for our online prime screen, and providers can use the prime screen link in session with folks if they're interested. And if you are interested in learning more about our prime screen online link, let me know and I can connect you with Doha, and she can talk you through how it works and maybe help establish it in other places. So this is just a little bit more about the online prime screen and how we give feedback, that this is a conduit to our referral system. Now, I mentioned that the 2-item screening is sort of something that people are looking forward to and that use in our community. This has really taken off in some of the colleges that we partner with. In Liz Thompson's dissertation, what she looked to do was to implement screening within a college sample the College Counseling Center. What we were able to do was to screen all people that came in for mental health services at the UMBC Counseling Center. So we had about 510 folks participate. And of that group, just coming in not for psychosis risk screening, but just general mental health concerns that would bring a person into a counseling center, 26.7% screened positive on the PRIME screen. Now, we were able to do SIPS interviews on 44 of those, and almost 56% of those interviewed. So about 23 were deemed to be at clinical high risk. So if we're thinking about the accuracy of the PRIME screen in a clinic that wasn't designed for psychosis risk, but it's just a mental health clinic at a university, a college counseling center, accuracy about 77%. So pretty strong utility there. But what we've done subsequent to the end of the research study was we've worked with the counseling center to have the two item screening questions integrated into the standard battery from henceforth. So anybody who says yes to one of those questions automatically gets referred to our clinic in Doha, works to facilitate a further assessment and to evaluate whether or not they might be eligible for our clinical services. Now, I want to dive a little deeper into, I think, what are some important nuances in screening for risk for psychosis. So the symptoms of psychosis risk should sort of dictate a psychosis risk label. You have symptoms, and those symptoms lead to a diagnosis. But there's a lot of confounds. There are other factors that contribute to a person's expression of experiences that may not be related to risk. So these things look like risk or may contribute to the label, but in fact, there's something completely different, and they may not be pathological in the slightest. And I think it's important for us to pause and think about, the accurate pathway from symptom risk to accurate diagnosis so that we don't overdiagnose or overpathologize. And a lot of this comes from an attention to sensitive assessment. So bearing in mind issues related to culture, context, and the individual. And these will help us have stronger links between symptoms of psychosis risk to a true and accurate psychosis label. And I have a series of studies that I want to share that have been led by my student Zach Millman, who's on internship at McLean in Boston, and Camille Wilson, who's at Children's National as a professor and faculty there, and then Pamela Rakshan, who is one of my senior graduate students right now. So different confounds that might contribute to different ways about thinking about risk for psychosis. The studies that I want to share now all share similar overlapping methodology. So very diverse sample, about 130 people or so. And this is all of the folks in these studies were help-seeking. First study about race. So the specific research question that we had here was, are screening tools racially invariant? In other words, does the PRIME screen perform equally well for black and white participants? Cutting to the chase, you see here highlighted down below, the PRIME screen does predict risk. So in other words, if a person takes the PRIME screen and scores high, there's a good chance that that they're going to be meeting criteria for risk based on the SIPS or the clinician interview. That said, what you see here at the bottom is that the effect is significant for our white participants, but non-significant for our black participants. So the PRIME screen seems to work well for white people in our sample, but not so much for black people. And so that was a cautionary tale for us. So I'm going to skip some of these. But like some of the items actually work in the opposite direction for our black participants relative to what was expected. So what might this mean? Well, first off, I want to say that the PRIME screen, at least in our sample, does not adequately assess youth who are black. Potentially it lacks the required context. So what do these questions mean to you in the context in which you live? If we don't have that information and we just have a yes, we might interpret that yes or that endorsement as meaning something different than what the person who was responding to it meant. So in this case, screening alone may overpathologize. So we need to go deeper. We need to dig deep down to see what questions mean for particular individuals. That said, youth who are Black should not be considered monolithically. The prime screen does work for some of our youth who are Black, and it may not be race as the driving factor here. But it's something to be mindful of. All right. And to think more deeply about this, Pamela is working on finishing writing up a paper now where she's looking at the relation between the CHR-P positive symptoms, not necessarily screening, but the CHR-P itself, and functioning. And what she's seen in our sample is that for white participants, in this case, zeroing in on suspiciousness, or P2 of the CHR-Ps, higher scores on suspiciousness for our white participants equals a reduction of functioning. So people are struggling more. But for our participants who are Black, higher scores on suspiciousness is not associated with reduction in functioning or lower functioning. So again, these questions are seemingly meaning something very different between these two groups of people, not monolithically, but as groups. All right, the next study I want to talk about is in keeping with that work from Pamela, but in this case, we're not talking specifically about race, but rather exposure to neighborhood crime. And so in this case, we were asking ourselves, does neighborhood crime impact responses to the CHR-Ps? I think if you just look at those CHR-Ps questions related to suspiciousness, you'll get a sense as to why we wanted to do this study. So have you ever found yourself feeling mistrustful or suspicious of other people? Do you ever feel that you have to pay close attention to what's going on around you in order to feel safe? Do you ever feel like you're being singled out or watched? Now, there are so many different reasons why a person would say yes to these questions, and many of them have nothing to do with psychopathology. And we wanted to get at that a little bit because I think it's important, and if we don't think about these things, we run the risk of over-pathologizing. So what we did here was we created a neighborhood crime index based on our participant's address, how much crime was going on in their neighborhood. And we correlated that with the suspiciousness scale, or the P2 of the CHR-Ps. And what we found was a significant correlation. And furthermore, that correlation seemed to be somewhat independent from the rest of the CHR-Ps tools. So using a multiple regression, predicting the suspiciousness scale while controlling for the other CHR-Ps items, the neighborhood crime factor still was significant. So this is more than just about psychosis risk. Now, what might it be? We didn't have the chance to look at the mechanisms, but neighborhood is more than just, the effects is beyond just psychosis, and we think that it could be related to things such as healthy contextual mistrust, as opposed to being misinterpreted as psychopathology. So healthy contextual mistrust is this notion that mistrust or suspiciousness is warranted given the context in which a person is living. Now, that being said, I think it's important to emphasize that living in a high crime neighborhood could also be a stressor and a risk factor for psychosis itself. So I'm not saying that just living in a high crime neighborhood, that's why a person says yes to these questions on the CHR-Ps and they're not at risk for psychosis. But I am saying that it's something that we need to consider and to begin to tease apart and look for convergent lines of evidence to get a clearer picture as to what might be going on. Next study was also led by Pamela, and here we were wanted to explore a little bit of a sort of an anecdotal experience that we were having, which was we kept thinking that we were finding that younger kids, the younger participants in our sample, were more likely to say yes to questions on their screening tools. But when we interviewed them, they seemed to not share the same understanding as we did initially around psychosis risk. So youth report more clinical high-risk experiences, but do these younger participants interpret screening questions as intended? So are they in fact more at risk, or are they just misinterpreting the questions in a way that wasn't intended? And again, cutting to the chase, what you'll see here in that one shaded box, is that the specificity for our youngest group, after we split our sample into age ranges, so younger, middle, and higher, specificity was really quite low for our young group. So what that suggests is that on the self-report, when asked to fill out a questionnaire, the younger kids were more likely to say yes to questions. And that didn't always align or correspond with the responses that they were sharing with the SIPs. So they endorsed more self-report items, but they were diagnosed less when interviewed by our clinicians. So this might suggest that we should consider age-based norms when thinking about developmental considerations. Now, another study led by Pamela, factor structure, because items might mean different things between respondents and clinicians. And are some items better than others? So here what we found is two factors within the prime screen, doing a factor analysis on a large group of folks. Two factors account for about 60% of the variance, which isn't bad. They line up here. Factor 1 is about 8 items, and factor 2 has about 4 items. Now, factor 1, these are things like, I think that I felt that there are odd or unusual things going on that I can't explain. Or I think I may be able to hear my own thoughts being said out loud. Factor 2, a slightly different flavor to these items. I think that I might be able to predict the future. I've had the experience of doing something different because of my superstitions. I think I might have, gifts or talents. Now, what we found here was that factor 1 seemed to correspond well with clinician diagnosis, global functioning, and social functioning, as would be expected. So the more items that you endorsed from these questions, I think that I felt that are odd, unusual things going on I can't explain, the worse off things were in terms of diagnosis and functioning. In contrast, however, the factor 2 items were not significantly related to diagnosis or global functioning, but in fact they were related to social functioning, but in the inverse direction. So the more items, the more times you said you had superstitions or could predict the future, the higher your social functioning. Now we think that that might be that people are interpreting the items, like those items in particular, as sort of adaptive, more kind of like typical responses. These items are not pathological, and that people that have superstitions could be more social or whatever. In short, not all questions, at least from our data, are indicative of psychopathology, and so we're thinking about what this might mean in terms of distilling the best of the prime screen, as I was alluding to earlier. Okay, the last study in this section is one that we're working on currently. Another one that Pamela just wrapped up, actually. But were the results of study 4 related to contextual or racial factors? So we're sort of like digging in a little deeper to answer some of the questions that we're raising as we answer more questions. So, but here we examine the association between item scores across race groups with measures of mental well-being, trauma, community violence, and racial discrimination. And I'm only going to highlight some of these things, but red boxes are differences that we wouldn't anticipate or want between our participants who are black and our participants who are white. And what this table is showing are the correlations between individual prime items and our measure of mental well-being. And the only one that seemed to work as we would have hoped or anticipated was item 12. Now, for all participants, we think that these 3 items, 2, 6, and 8, may not be the best for understanding risk for psychosis or psychopathology in general. I think that I might be able to predict the future. I've thought that it might be possible that other people can read my mind, and I believe that I have special natural or supernatural gifts. These items just don't predict risk. This one item in particular seemed to be questionable in particular for our participants who are black. I wonder if people may be planning to hurt me or even may be about to hurt me. Not a good item for our participants who are black. So items with poor fit and validity, they can be confounded by community violence and discrimination. That was sort of our bottom line there. Lots of future direction with this. I think it's important. I'm going to skip, but hopefully there'll be opportunities to have my slides or to look at this slide in particular, because there's a lot of good ideas that I think that are represented on this slide for how to think through more accurate screening and identification of people at risk that's culturally and contextually informed, and also trauma informed. But in the interest of time, I'm going to keep on rolling, and because I want to cover some other things. But I do know that all of this stuff I think is important given the prioritization of SAMHSA and NIMH in thinking about these issues. So switching over to thoughts about treatment. Moving on to thoughts about treatment, I want to say that start this by a paper that Liz took lead on, where we found that our people at risk for psychosis were elevated in symptoms of psychosis risk, as you might expect, but also had all sorts of other issues that they were concerned about. And so comorbidity and issues related to other things besides psychosis risk is more the norm than the exception. Anxiety, depression, attention problems, social stress, locus of control, all things that were challenging and more challenging, rated as more challenging relative to other help-seeking control folks who were not at risk for psychosis but had some other mental health concern. Trauma, also a big part of the lives of people at clinical high risk in many cases. Our work is just one of many studies that have looked at trauma and clinical high risk, and what we're seeing is that trauma is very common in people at risk for psychosis, even more than our other participants in our sample who were help-seeking but not at risk for psychosis. And there's important nuances and moderation with trauma as well that I think is important. Thinking about specific populations of interest in, I get a lot of questions about the link between clinical high risk and autism. And in a study pioneered by Camille, where she interviewed experts in the field of autism as well as young people with autism on the SIPs, what she found was that the experts noted many items that they thought that people with autism would be confused by or could possibly be confused by. So much so that care should really be taken when administering the SIPs to people with autism. For instance, have you had the feeling that something odd is going on, that something is wrong that you can't explain? Do familiar people or surroundings ever seem strange? Do you daydream a lot? These questions could be interpreted in all sorts of different ways by someone with autism. And if a strict yes was ascribed without understanding what they really mean, then we could over-pathologize. Her findings are somewhat nuanced, though, with respect to the SIPs administration. So what she was finding was that, in general, people with autism can, in fact, understand the SIPs. Now, sometimes they ask for more clarification or say that they don't know, more often than control or people without autism, but that they get it. And the cautions of the SIPs hold for those with as well as those without autism spectrum disorders. So just being mindful that your audience, regardless of their diagnosis, making sure that they understand the questions. That's the take-home message with our work so far with autism. Families experience a tremendous amount of burden in taking care of young people that are in early phases of psychosis and having risk for psychosis. And I want to just share a couple of themes that my student in Hawaii, actually, Jane Knock, uncovered in some interviews. This is around difficulties and stressors. She says, this is a quote from a parent that says, they become the focus of your entire life. And you actually feel kind of bad about that because you have 4 children and you'd like to say that you're spending 25% of your time with each of them. But we spend 90 on him. It never goes out of your mind. You're constantly concerned with being a caregiver. Another theme was around needs for support and more services. We asked for guidance at home and we never really got any because the advice was vague and not very helpful. As he got older and his behaviors got more severe, for this particular physician, the solution was that he seemed to have wanted him to hit rock bottom and have police involved, like a detention home kind of situation. Problems with services. Most providers don't give me any strategies whatsoever. Okay, he had this and here's this and that. There's not a lot of talk about it. How can we help? Or strategies or things like that. It's mainly, this is a diagnosis, here's the meds. And if I say, but someone else said this, it's very dismissive. It's pretty much, this is how it is, take it or leave it. And the last quote that I want to share from Jane's work says, I have more of a 6-year plan. My hope is that by the time he's 25, that he can be at least halfway independent. who always need a lot of support. This is a video that I'm not going to show, but I'll describe it very briefly. And it depicts the negative attitudes and external stigma that people with psychosis and schizophrenia, early risk for psychosis, may experience. So basically, I was asked to like be a part of like some newscast about psychosis, and I said this was around the time of Sandy Hook, and I said, yes, I will talk about psychosis and psychosis risk, but I'm not going to talk about a link for violence because it's just it's too distinct. Like there's not a strong enough link between psychosis risk, and violence. And they said, fine, sure, whatever. So I was basically like on the phone, but they were videotaping me. I couldn't see what they were showing. And what they ended up showing were all these ghastly pictures of like guns and people evacuating and people looking, deranged. And my little head, like in like an eighth of the screen, de-emphasizing the points that I was trying to share about development and people living a life of their choosing, and how people with psychosis are far more similar than they are different from people without psychosis. It was all lost, and it was really distressing. But that's the kind of media portrayal that we often see, and that creates a culture where people aren't eager to get help because they're afraid of the potential consequences of that help. Despite that, there are brave people standing up, sharing their stories. This is a clip that I won't show, but this is one of our partners. Her name is Lizelle, and she talks about some of her challenges with mental health and psychosis and how she recovered from them and the supports and getting the help that she needed that led her to great outcomes and college degree and a great job. We actually created a film full of narratives such as the one that picture that you saw of Lizelle, and we share it with college students, and we tested to see if the impact of that video, that compilation, could influence a person's willingness to go and seek treatment and help. And cutting to the chase on this one, what you'll see here is it says targeted video, and that's the one that's specifically towards reducing stigma for young people or college students. Among people in our study who watched that video, who reported some amount of psychological distress, they were much more inclined after watching that video to go get help. And this effect was only demonstrated in the specific video that was designed for that very purpose. And it gives us promise that videos such as this and contact interventions where people without psychosis or that maybe haven't revealed their psychosis to other people or shared those experiences can get help, and if other people come out and share their stories. The folks on the right pioneered this work, Danielle Deneny, who's faculty at UCLA, and Aaron Kruger, who's at Mount Washington here in Baltimore, and Joe DeLuca, my clinical intern for our CHR program, and Leanne Shen, who's a graduate student in my program. Here you see Samantha Redman, who's one of our outreach coordinators for our anti-stigma work. And this is, we want to go beyond and create communities that are more inclusive. And here's a picture of us doing our flash mob, where we raise awareness for mental health in a fun way. And then after the flash mob, we have a panel where students at our college share some of their stories of mental health challenges with an open and affirming group that's all excited to learn. Now, switching into how we approach care or treatment for those at risk for psychosis, a lot of our thoughts are captured in a review article that we published a few years back. But basically, we were challenged with this question of how do we create an evidence-based program for folks when there isn't an evidence base that currently exists, especially when antipsychotic meds or medications aren't applicable or recommended at this time. We're very client-driven, but we're also scientifically supported. We don't think that those two things contradict one another. In fact, we wanted them both. So we were guided by one of my mentors when I was at the University of Hawaii, Bruce Torpeda, and his innovation around modular approaches to care. And basically, we integrate evidence-based treatment and approaches through a flexible and faithful way where we have modules that can stand by themselves and can be chosen by the client as well as the therapist in collaboration with one another. Always in collaboration. So we have a very strong commitment to shared decision making. It's probably the case for many folks that work with folks at clinical high risk for psychosis that you understand that shared decision making is so important, because people at clinical high risk, they don't come into our clinic saying, hey, I want help with my attenuated psychosis syndrome. They say, I'm having trouble making friends, or I want to have more of a social life, or I'm failing out of school, or I don't see much of a meaning in going on or life. So anxiety, depression, all sorts of other things related to functioning. These are the things that we really see. And so having a flexible approach allows us to work with the client and to prioritize what's most important to them. So our sources of knowledge, CBT for risk for psychosis, there's some literature out there about that. It's minimal, but it's there. CBT for psychosis more broadly, that's available. And then those general concerns beyond psychosis risk. We also think about treatment informed by mechanisms. We believe in a diathesis stress model, which suggests that stress is a really important component towards the development of psychosis. So working to create ways in which clients can manage their stress better, and also working in ways in which clients can reduce the stress that their environment is causing, can work hand in hand to help folks. Always getting input from youth and families in our stakeholder group. This is just our distillation of the literature and what folks are doing, what we were able to determine what folks are doing in the literature in terms of working with people at risk for psychosis. But we really think that context matters, so that we have all sorts of different modules that are well-rounded and broad enough to meet the different needs of our clients. Much of it starts with psychoeducation. Almost all of our clients get safety, there's CBT, but then there's other things like just general problem solving irrespective of psychosis risk, relapse prevention, social skills, wellness. So I know there's a lot on this particular figure. I think I'm going to zoom in a moment, but so this is like the top half of this, and this is like a roadmap so that our clinicians can use with the clients to determine which steps they want to take next when working with their clients. Everything begins with engagement. Of course, this should be true of all therapy, but engagement is king. So if there's not close engagement, then we don't go anywhere. So working together with our clients first and foremost, and that often leads to a strong, valid assessment. Some of the, like using the SIPs and the case ads and screening tools to understand what's really going on with the individual. So we use the term individual clinical formulation. Some people use case conceptualization, but we feel like if we talk about the individual, really emphasize the person that we're working with as opposed to a particular case, so to speak. So we really want this to be personalized. Unfortunately, many of our clients require some sort of safety planning. So about 80% of our clients have some sort of suicidal ideation, and we develop a safety plan for that. And I'll share with you some of our tools for that as well. Psychoeducation, and then there's motivational enhancement or motivational techniques if the person's not really interested or motivated towards the therapy. But what I want to emphasize here is that even if you don't have a lot of experience working with somebody at clinical high risk for psychosis, the main components of our treatment model are probably skills and tools that you use in most of your clients. We strongly believe that people with psychosis or psychosis risk are far more similar than they are different than people without. And sure, there's a few unique aspects of our training module that are specific to clinical high risk, but by and large, most of it is things like family therapy or social skills, school or occupational support, coping, relaxation, wellness, what have you. Now, even if we're working on those other non-CHR clinical high-risk symptoms, we're always monitoring our symptoms and making sure that safety is still at the forefront of our minds. But these complement some things related to psychosis risk. Now, if a person says they want to work on psychosis risk, then we have specific treatments and strategies to work with that as well. But that's not necessarily required or the core even. Now, we always address competing priorities while maintaining structure. One client that I thought I just mentioned briefly, he was a 17-year-old wanting to go to college, but was having CHR symptoms around fearing that there was a monster in his room when he turned the lights off. And it took him a while for him to admit this to us, so that, he had some shame around it. But once we got wrong on that, we realized that there was that issue. But he wasn't all that motivated to begin therapy around that. But he was motivated to go to college, and he was in a self-contained school, and he wanted to move out of that. So that was where we got some buy-in with him. He originally unengaged with therapy. Also, it turns out he wanted to be a psychology major, so I happen to know a little about that, so we bonded on that front. And then, so once we got motivation higher, we asked him, what's your main concern? If you had to prioritize something, what would it be? And he said it was getting, success in school. He was also a little overweight, so we worked on wellness as well. And then later on, we kept monitoring his symptoms. Then some of his school stuff was improving, his wellness was improving, but his symptoms were getting worse. So then we circled back around into CBT for CHR and challenged some of his beliefs and behaviors, did some experiments, and eventually made some inroads in his progress around that as well. And happy to say that he did go to college. So lots of different examples of different challenges and needs and priorities of some of our clients that I won't go into now, but probably look similar to folks that you've met or worked with, irrespective of psychosis risk. Now, we have a module, like a manual for this work. So it's chock full of different modules that represent some of the things that I was sharing there. So you'll see we have, we're building training videos. This is Pamela and Nikki role-playing there. There's worksheets. There's the map. Here is a snapshot of our safety planning tools. If anyone's interested in learning more about safety planning, suicidality is very common. This is led by Sammy J., who's our expert in risk for suicidality within our team. Now, these are not our tools per se, but I can recommend them and send you how we use them. Modules are being spearheaded by my postdoc, Mallory Klonick. All sorts of different examples here: motivational enhancement, helpful clinical risk tools. There's another role-playing video with Caroline and Mallory, challenging thoughts, some wellness exercises. I want to say that we provide trainings. So this is the picture on the upper left is a training we did in Memphis and Nashville. So it's my SAMHSA team there. We've looking forward to training. We have some other trainings scheduled, and there's training down below. We also do SIPS training. So I'm one of 3 certified SIPS trainers in the nation. So if you're interested in SIPS training, feel free to reach out to me as well. And I am wrapping up here. I might need some assistance in being able to see the questions because of the way the tech was operating today. I was unable to see questions as they were coming up, so please forgive me. I was not ignoring you on purpose if you were asking me questions. Just end with this quote that I heard from Brandon Stagman, who's sort of a really important figure in the field. He says, "Enthusiasm and hope are what make the difference." And I couldn't be more in agreement with that statement, and I'm so grateful for my team who shares that, both that enthusiasm and hope. So thank you very much. I think we got about 10 minutes left, and I'm going to ask for some help on the question stuff, and I appreciate it.
Great. Thank you so much, Jason. This is Tamara again, and I have been kind of pulling out the questions and trying to group them a little bit. Obviously, there are a number of questions about, can we get copies of the manual and the family tool and a bunch of things. So I suspect people will want copies of as much as they can get.
Can't give copies of the manuals just yet, but we do offer training for them. And the plan is for us to be able to disseminate the manuals and stuff when they're like fully ready to roll. But in the meantime, we do, if people are interested in learning more about them, some of us go out to do trainings and stuff, and that's usually really fun. So, but if you're not interested in training, but you are interested in manuals, then just hang tight, because we'll have them hopefully ready before you know it.
Great, thank you. So there were a number of questions related to the screening section. Jerome Taylor, MD, is a child psychiatrist at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and he had two questions. The first was, I've asked some of the clinicians who use the prime for kids 11 to 14-ish. Some clinicians have said some of the questions are too complicated and confuse kids. Do you have any suggestions? And then related to that, he said, I missed the beginning, but do you have younger kids, 11 to 15, fill out the self-report or verbally ask them, and how do you make sure they understand it?
Yeah, okay, great question. That makes me think of a paper that Pamela Raksham was first author on, that really affirms what you were saying there, and I talked about that a little during the presentation. But what we do find, consistent with what your clinicians are saying, is that the folks, our participants, we go down to about 12, but the younger participants in our sample tend to over-endorse questions. So they are saying yes on the self-report, but then when we probe and talk to them in person to make sure that we have a shared understanding of the meaning of the questions, then they change their answer basically, or tell us something that's more consistent with on the SIPS interview. So definitely the clinical implication for this is when younger kids say yes to a self-report, talk to them. Use it as a leverage for conversation, and see if what they're experiencing is psychosis risk or just a different interpretation of the question. But definitely something to be clinically mindful of. And I do think that there are some questions within the prime screen that are worded in such a way that are too confusing for younger people, and maybe too confusing for anybody for that matter. I think there's 3 items that we should toss. But I also think that the prime was intended originally for to be worded in a way that kind of gave risk more of do you kind of feel like maybe sort of, to make it a little bit more across the continuum. So on the one hand, that gives us more variability, but on the other, it gives us more confusion. So thank you so much for that question, Dr. Taylor.
Great. And then we have a couple of questions related to the contextual issues that you had brought up. The first one is from Laura Craig, and I'll read both sets of questions so you can try to kind of incorporate them given time. So Laura asked, can you provide an example or two that you would look for someone who lives in a dangerous neighborhood and has suspiciousness that you would consider to still be at risk for psychosis? And then the second question is from Kaylin Large. I'm curious if screening tools are in many ways ineffective for Black youth, meaning they are likely less effective for other non-white racial groups. What does this mean for communities who work mostly in non-white communities? How do we effectively screen and approach community outreach with community providers as well as non-providers in our communities, especially those that experience higher rates of violence and discrimination?
Yes. I mean, these are excellent questions. I'm so glad that you all have been sensitive to them. So the first question about, how do we look for risk beyond, the impact of the neighborhood crime? So they're saying yes, but could it be even more? There's a couple of suggestions I have for that. One is, have a deeper conversation that goes beyond just the suspiciousness questions. So, are there other symptoms of psychosis risk that are showing up, like unusual thoughts or like perceptual abnormalities. So that's one thing, so that you can kind of triangulate around related experiences or symptoms. Two is to get us, if possible, to try to get a sense as to what other informants might say. So, like, if a mom or if a parent is in the picture, or a family member, do they think that the person's experiences are extreme or beyond what other folks in the community feel? Another suggestion I have is to ask the client, him or herself, if they think their responses are more extreme than others in their community. And then also just be curious and probe about other experiences that they may have. So, like, it could be, is there an interaction between neighborhood crime and violence and their own experience of trauma? And so, so you're thinking beyond just psychosis risk, and also beyond, like, contextual factors, but how contextual factors might be impacting the individual. So those are just a couple of thoughts that I have off the top of my head, but it's a very important question, and it's just being sensitive to the question, I think, is probably the key. And hopefully, if you're able to continue working with the person, then, like, over time, a lot of these, like, sort of nuanced questions sort of clarify themselves as you get to know the client and know her or his experiences. So those are some thoughts about that. Now, working in non-white communities, this is something that we're really passionate about, trying to figure out better ways. So we're trying to figure out which items we can use, and if we need to, like, create new measures. So screening right now, I think, is limited in non-white communities, and I think in terms of, like, its accuracy for psychosis risk. That said, I don't know that it's completely completely a loss. I think some items work better than others, and I think if we have the resources and we're working in marginalized communities or other groups that are often victims of oppression, that having the conversations and being present for those folks can be part of a better and beneficial process, even if our tools haven't caught up with where, or aren't where they need to be.
Right.
But
Great, thank you.
I'm still working on it.
Yeah, it sounds like plenty of room for additional conversation. Let's see, I believe the PRIME screening tools have been translated into other languages. Have they not?
I don't know that the PRIME screen itself has, but I could be wrong about that. I'm sorry that I'm not sure, but I know the SIPS has. So the SIPS is available in many languages.
Yeah. So we could check. We can check with Yale on that question. Yeah, I think we are now at 11:29. I think we've run through pretty much all the questions except maybe one or two that I had. So we will follow up with everybody who's participated and give you the link to the learning management system, and we will be posting the video, and then also we'll continue this dialogue if people have additional questions or want to get into a deeper exploration of some of the really important topics that Jason has been discussing. So thank you guys so much for joining us. What an amazing conversation. Makes me want to move to Maryland, hang out with you.
We'll have you anytime. I will put you on the first flight if you would want to do that. We'll have dinner tonight.
That sounds fun. So, yeah, see you all in Maryland, I guess.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. I'm very grateful.
All right, thank you so much. And everybody says thank you for your great answers on screening, and thank you. This is really informative. So, yeah. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.